Welcome into the Hang Time Podcast. I'm your host, Sekou Smith, here in Atlanta, and we are upon it. The start of the NBA season. Hours, I'm not even going to say days anymore, it's hours away. And coming to you live on Monday morning as we get into the season to start on December 22nd. And John Schuhmann from NBA.com. What's up? Are you ready for this NBA season to tip off?
I actually am. I'm actually really excited. Got a little taste in the preseason, and I'm excited to see Stephen Curry, Kevin Durant play basketball again, especially. It's weird because of the sort of situation that we're all in, and sometimes you can sort of put it aside and focus on the basketball. Sometimes you can't. But all things considered, yeah, I'm pretty excited for the season to start again.
Power rankings for you, Shu, I know is a labor of love that takes up a ton of time. When you're doing it to kick off a season, how much of what you factor into it is last season? How much is what you've seen a team do during the offseason? How much of it is a sheer projection of what you think they're going to do this season? I mean, how do you come up with the gumbo for power rankings before we see any games?
First of all, we'll put it out there right now, and I'll probably repeat this many times during the season, that I don't put much effort into ranking the teams. You know, like 99% of the effort goes into what's written about each team. And then at the end, we sort of put them in an order. But in general, I think I'm more of a wait and see kind of guy. Like, so say, for example, the Hawks, made big changes, but they were really bad last year. So it's we can move them up a little bit, but before I consider them to be on the level of, say the Pacers or other teams that are going to be sort of play-in scrum in the Eastern Conference, I kind of want to see some results. And, the great thing about power rankings is that you get to do them over again every week. So if I rank a team too low at the start of the season and they look really good to start to see, well, I'll just move them up next week. I'm not too full of myself to think that I got it all right here in week one.
Does a team like the Lakers coming off a championship, do they kind of automatically slot themselves into that top spot or one of those top spots because of that?
Yeah, for sure. I think, though, like coming off of that championship, I thought, the Lakers were still somewhat of a flawed team, a little bit like a flaw in the context of being a champ, that they had issues specifically with shooting and half court offense, but then they got better. So I see why, like in our GM survey, they were the overwhelming favorite, and it is hard, at the start of the season to put another team on their same tier at the top, there's teams with potential to get there. But until we see it, you got to put the Lakers on their own tier.
In lieu of our normal conversation we would probably have about power rankings, rather than dissect this first batch, let's talk about some teams that maybe intrigue going into the season. One East, one West. I'll start with your first team. Give me either one that you think is one to watch this first couple of weeks of the season, regular season, just to see how they come together.
One for me, and they've been fascinating for 3 years now, is the Philadelphia 76ers. I watch a Sixers game, and I watch every offensive possession in which Joel Embiid and Ben Simmons are both on the floor with a microscope. Like, I am rewinding, slowing down everything. I want to know what they're running, like where Ben Simmons is spaced, where Joel Embiid is catching the ball, whether either one is getting in the other one's way in regard to their ability to get to the basket, how much movement is going. Like, I seriously, I watched Embiid played 17 minutes in the preseason, and I was just fascinated by all 17 of those minutes, especially on the offensive end of the floor. He amazingly took 14 shots in 17 minutes, which is kind of hilarious. And the one thing I look at with Embiid is where are those shots coming from? And only 4 of those 14 shots, and it's preseason. Believe me, I understand it's preseason, but It's my sort of fascination with the Sixers. Only 4 of those 14 shots came in the paint. 10 of them came outside the paint. And like that's not a good ratio for Joel Embiid. He needs to be eating in the posts, scoring in the paint, rather than being the guy who's spacing the floor for Ben Simmons.
What was his ratio last season?
It was just over 50%, which is not good either. It went from like 50 it went from about 59% in the paint the season before to about 49% in the paint last season. So it went in a bad direction last season. And that's going to be like a number that I will refer to many, many times during this year, because I just want to see, because the difference between his field goal percentage in the paint and his effective field goal percentage outside the paint, even when you take threes into account, is huge. And so he needs to be shooting by near the basket and catching the ball near the basket. And getting him to do that is the sort of never-ending challenge for the Sixers, no matter who the coach is.
Yeah, and I thought that was something that Doc Rivers would fix right away. Like, if you're a new coaching staff and you come in and put fresh eyes on the Sixers, that's got to be one of the first things you notice.
But you still have two guys that are best inside the paint. And in today's NBA, to run a sort of smooth functioning offense, you need, one guy who functions in the paint, whether it be an Embiid type or a Russell Westbrook type who just attacks, and then 4 guys who can shoot around him. And the Sixers can't do that when they have both of those guys on the floor together. So it'll be fascinating. I mean, they tried to run some creative stuff. If you check out my Twitter account, I tweeted out some videos of them doing some stuff. Believe me, they can be absolutely dominant defensively. So if they can be really, really good defensively and get out and run enough, then their half court offense isn't as important as it will be with other teams. I mean, Ben Simmons is just a monster defensively. Like, as much as we focus on his offensive issues, he is a monster. Like, if you're listening to this and you're at your computer, or you will be at your computer, I want people to do this. Go to nba.com/games, navigate to last Friday, December 18th, and click on the Sixers-Pacers game. Go to the box score, go to Ben Simmons' line, and just click on the number 2 in the blocks column and watch him absolutely smother Malcolm Brogdon on 2 possessions in the second quarter. It was just, I mean, he's as fun to watch defensively as like a Curry or Lillard can be offensively.
To me, he's one of those players too that's often, dinged because he doesn't have a great 3-point shot. You forget how much other work can get done on the floor outside of just being a good shooter. I know that's become a topic for almost every star player, is whether or not he can shoot. But like you mentioned, Simmons impacts a game in so many different ways, and I think we underappreciate what he does a lot of times. My team that I'm intrigued to see to start this season is Boston, at least in the Eastern Conference. And it's based largely, Shu, on the way they finished their season in the bubble against Miami, where it was clear that they were an impact player short, from being a team that could play in the finals. They lose Gordon Hayward, who I thought, were he healthy, you could make sense out of a group, a core group of he, Kemba Walker, Marcus Smart, Jason Tatum, and Jaylen Brown, and be pretty formidable, have a good chance to compete in the East. Boston hasn't added anybody to me that's a significant, difference maker for him. But I think Tatum has an opportunity to take a huge step. Obviously, Jaylen Brown, I really love what he does. And Kemba's coming off, some knee issues, and is going to be coming back from that when he starts playing. I just don't know if Boston stays in that upper tier in the East based on what's going on since they left the bubble. And that's why I want to see what they look like to start the season. They're going to have some interesting matchups with a Brooklyn team that I think is going to become a formidable rival for them and everybody else trying to get to the top of the East. I need to see if Boston is still keeping pace with that pack or if they've fallen back. I noticed you got them, I think 8th in these first power rankings. It would seem to me that you think they're in that gray area, like they could slip down a little bit, or if they play well, they can move up. Where do you see the Celtics at this stage of the game? Just right when we're tipping off the season.
Yeah, I mean, well, obviously not having Kemba Walker hurts, and their depth is rough. Like in their preseason, they started Javonte Green in place of Kemba Walker, and if you could pick out Javonte Green in a lineup, Sekou, I would be impressed. Um, they're counting on guys like Grant Williams, who didn't play much last year in the regular season, but then showed some stuff in the playoffs. They're counting on Jeff Teague, who was on a couple of has been on a was has a ton of experience, a ton of playoff experience too, but was just on a couple of irrelevant teams the last couple of years. I'm curious about Jaylen Brown actually. Without Hayward and obviously without Walker for the start of the season, he's got to become more of a playmaker. I think we know what Tatum can do, and we know that Tatum's going to get better, but they need other guys to make plays. And Brown hasn't been that guy yet in his career. He's done everything else. Like he's defended really well. He's incredible in transition. He's a really good finisher, shoots well off the catch, and obviously can move off the ball. But as far as on the ball stuff, he hasn't done a lot. Hasn't been a good shooter off the dribble. Not a guy that has that drives a lot. And in their preseason game against the Nets the other day, I mean, they got waxed by Brooklyn, but there was at one point where they ran like an after timeout play for Jaylen Brown to run pick and roll, and he made a couple nice plays. And I thought his passing was kind of opened my eyes a little bit in the preseason. It was preseason, but little hints of that kind of stuff can be important.
In a league where everybody, generally there tends to be this movement where style of play is similar. A lot of, everybody wants to get threes up. Everybody technically wants to play at a faster pace. How big of a curveball do you think Stan could throw, being a coach from a different era who understands the analytics as well as anybody, but will not be a slave to it, will come in and figure out what his group does best and then play to that? Because people forget Stan played 4 out with Dwight Howard back in the day when that wasn't the way everybody was playing. So it's not like he's some throwback. I mean, he's a guy who's obviously understands where the game is, but I get the feeling that he might try and play differently because of the personnel in New Orleans.
Well, I mean, heck, just starting Williamson and Steven Adams together is a little bit old school because neither of those guys ever shoots from outside the paint, right? Mm-hmm. So, but it could really help. It could work defensively, and then they could space the floor with some of their other units. Redick coming off the bench is obviously going to be critical in regard to complementing Williamson, which I think is why Williamson will be the guy that starts the second quarters with the bench, because then you can pair him with Redick. Ingram's going to do his, I don't think Stan's going to force Ingram to not shoot mid-range shots. And that's because Brandon Ingram's going to want to get to his spot and do his thing. So I think the most important thing is that team has more consistency and better focus and better effort defensively.
Yeah. Who's the team in the West that has piqued your interest going into the season?
I'm kind of fascinated by Portland. I see what they're doing with adding Robert Covington and Derrick Jones Jr. It seems like they're trying to replicate their success from a few years ago when they had Maurice Harkless and Al-Farouq Aminu at the forward positions, and they were actually a pretty good defensive team that year. Last year, they were atrocious defensively. And, you're obviously not going to improve in the backcourt because Damian Lillard and CJ McCollum are your guards. You're not going to take one of those guys off the floor so you can get better defensively, because they help you become one of the best offensive teams in the league. And Nurkic is Nurkic. And so they went at the forward spots and tried to improve defensively there. The question is, Covington and only shot like 34% from three last year. Derrick Jones Jr. was one of the worst 3-point shooters in the league last year. But I wonder, who's handling the ball when Lillard and McCollum are off the floor? Are they staggering their minutes again? Are they going to go back to staggering their minutes? Because is the ball handling, a combination of Anthony Simons and Rodney Hood? Like, is that enough, with their bench? And then their second unit front line seems to be Carmelo Anthony and Enes Kanter. And that is a huge problem defensively. Like, they're going to get destroyed defensively if those two guys are on the floor together. So how do they manage that situation where they don't expose those guys too much defensively if they're playing together? That's another kind of question I have.
The other thing that always marks the advent of a new season is the GM survey. Another one of your heavy lifts, I know. Give me one takeaway before we get out of here on the Hang Time Podcast. What's the one thing that came back to you on the GM survey that made an eyebrow raise for you?
For me, it was Luka Doncic getting the same number of votes as Giannis Antetokounmpo in the question of if you were starting a franchise today, who would you want? And I think that was kind of fascinating. I mean, Doncic is basically 4 years younger than Giannis, but Giannis is a two-way star, like a two-way stud who just makes a huge impact on both ends of the floor. Whereas Doncic, while he's not a terrible defender, he's 6'7", so he's big, is basically a offense only kind of star right now. It just kind of tells you how good he is and good he can be offensively, and how important that sort of it is to have a guy like that who's handling the ball and is a triple threat, so to speak, as far as shooting, driving, passing. I mean, I had him on my MVP ballot. I think I had him third or fourth on my MVP ballot last year. And that was when he was as a 21-year-old, because he was number 3 in the league in usage rate, which means he had the ball in his hands a ton. And his team had the number 1 offense in the league. To me, that's MVP, as long as he's not just a complete disaster defensively, and he wasn't. Right. And so I think the Mavs can be really, really good this year. They were 3rd in the West in point differential last year and finished 7th because they were terrible in close games. Mm-hmm. And so I think, like, if I was to sort of pick an MVP, like, he might be I don't like to make predictions, but he might be like the one guy I would say, I think this dude could be the MVP this year and when he just turns 22 years old in February.
It is my job to talk MVP, and I'll do that soon on the Kia Ray City MVP ladder on NBA.com. We'll be back Wednesday here on the Hang Time Podcast with a special guest. We appreciate you diving in with us here on the Hang Time Podcast. John Schuhmann, appreciate your time. Next week, we'll have a little bit to work with in terms of those first games of the season. Should be interesting to see where things shift between now and then. Don't forget, we're coming to you 3 times a week this season here on the Hang Time Podcast. So make sure you subscribe and check us out wherever you get your podcast. For my guest, John Schuhmann, appreciate you, sir. Talk to you, obviously, every day, but more and more as this season cranks up. And we'll see you right here next time on the Hang Time Podcast.